Using a new microphone. Does it work? Okay, close enough. So good morning. Welcome everyone to my Sunday morning interview service. I'm really excited about this morning because we're going to talk to Reverend Aisha Ansano, who is our affiliated community minister. What that means is that she doesn't work as a minister of this church, but she is affiliated with our church. That's something that the Unitarian Universalist Association requires of ministers who are not doing ministry in a specific church parish setting. So we are very lucky that Reverend Aisha chose to affiliate with us. That means she gets to help us with service a couple of times a year. She's the person that you call if I'm on vacation, that kind of thing. So we are so happy about that. So one of the things about Reverend Aisha is that her ministry outside of the church is in relation to something called dinner church, which is a kind of new way, I don't know, and old and ancient that we will see in terms of communion, way of coming together to do church. And so what we thought we could do this morning was have just a little bit of a conversation about Reverend Aisha's dinner church and what that looks like, since it's related to this idea of food as ritual, such as we are doing after this with communion. So wanted to start by asking you, Reverend Aisha, how did you get interested in food as ritual?
So I think there are two pieces of that, and one of them goes back to a time when I would not have said, oh, right now I'm becoming interested in food as ritual. But when I was growing up, my family ate dinner together every night. If people were busy, that was fine, but that was our default, that we would gather and eat dinner. We would set the table and we would pass around the food and serve ourselves. And we'd share a little bit about what was happening in our lives, in our days. And then we would clear the table, put things in the dishwasher, wash up. And so I think even before I realized that that is what I was creating, was this, being part of this idea of food as ritual, it really created a space for me kind of deep inside how I thought about food, where you could set aside a little bit of time for food, that it could be an important moment in your day. And then many, many, many years later, when I was at Harvard Divinity School, a friend said to me, there's a church called St. Lydia's Dinner Church. It's in Brooklyn, and their entire service is around a meal. It's called Dinner Church, and I think you'd like it. And so we went for the weekend to Brooklyn and experienced it. And that was a moment of a lot of clarity for me that this was how I wanted to do my ministry in the world. And I've been figuring it out since then.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. My family also has a tradition of sitting down for dinner and sharing a memory from the day. And I think seeing that as part of a wider sort of ritual, food as ritual, I think is really important. It can really ground you. So you right now, you have a dinner church consulting, I don't know what the right word is, but it's called Nourish. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about Nourish.
Yeah, so we are also still figuring out what the right word is for what we do. So I do Nourish UU with my good friend and colleague, Reverend Emily Conger, who is also a UU minister. And this is a ministry that we created in the pandemic to try to help meet the needs of folks in, as you know, this very strange time. And so the way that Nourish has worked over the last year and a half is that we talk with ministers, religious educators, other professionals, board leaders about the ways to incorporate embodiment and ritual and food into worship and into their community in general. And what that has been largely over the last year and a half is that we show up and we lead dinner church services, and we do all of the work so that the ministers and religious educators just have to show up. And we invite people into conversation and into ritual and into a little bit of thinking about what it means to be in your body and to have food as ritual. And then we also do consulting, where we have conversations mostly with religious professionals about how they might incorporate these things into their bigger community space. And this came out of I made the decision to start a dinner church. It was going to be here in Malden, and I started a ministry fellowship in January of 2020. And after the first day, I said, April 2020, I'm making it happen. You can imagine that gathering people around the table in April of 2020 was not an option anymore. And so I felt really lucky to be able to pivot in that way. And my dream is that that will one day be safe and welcoming and joyful, and that one day we will have an in-person dinner church here in Malden.
Yeah, I remember that first week of the pandemic, you were supposed to host a dinner church here actually for a bunch of ministers as kind of like and it was one of the first things I think that got canceled. It was like that Wednesday. So yeah, I really hear that. So, you talk about wanting to start a dinner church here in Malden, and I'd love to hear about, why you landed on Malden, because I know that you had just graduated, you had the opportunity to be anywhere. Why did you pick Malden?
Yeah, so we had been living in Cambridge for a long time, and I liked a lot of things about that. But like you said, I had this opportunity to say, not just how do I start this thing I want to start, but if I could start this in the ideal place, where would that be? And so we strongly considered moving around the country somewhere else. But we also realized that we had community in the Boston area already, and that is actually really important. And so, I started thinking about where in the Boston area would be good, and felt really drawn to Malden because it's a really diverse community, because there are a lot of young families, and because it feels like a place where people are willing to show up, to be in community. It's not quite as siloed as my experience of living in Cambridge was. And so again, we decided we were going to move to Malden, and then the pandemic happened. We did it anyway. So now we live here in Malden, my partner and I. And the more time I have spent here, the more it feels like it was the right choice, even though we have yet to start the thing that I'm here to start. But just getting to be a part of this community, and it really feels like a really solid place to hold that space and gather in community.
Yeah, for sure. So, I've heard about some different dinner churches, and mostly I've heard about Christian ones. And so I'm interested in how this helps you live into your Unitarian Universalism, and maybe also if you could just say, what is dinner church? What is it?
Yes.
What even happens at it?
Yes, I sometimes forget that I have spent 6 years thinking very deeply about dinner church. So at the core, dinner church is exactly what it sounds like. It's dinner and it's church, and they happen together. So it's not a service and then a potluck. It's a service that includes a meal. And it does come from the Christian tradition. It comes from the idea that communion, like we're doing today, is in most churches these days a small ritual that is symbolic of a larger meal, as Martha was telling us. But that in early Christianity, a lot of times people would gather in each other's homes for a worship service, and they would eat together, and that communion would be not just a brief moment of ritual, but it would be a full meal. And so a lot of folks have started thinking about, how can we bring that back? How can we make that a part of how we worship? And so it is new in a lot of ways, and then also it is extremely old in other ways. And so there are a lot of dinner churches, Christian dinner churches, that exist. For many, that this is the way they do church. They don't have Sunday morning worship. They have an evening worship. They're on different days. There are a lot of churches that mix it in as some sort of ministry of the church, but they also have other things. But I think there are also, one of the things that really resonated for me the first time I went to dinner church was this deep moment of embodiment and what it means to eat together, and how that felt really community building for me. And so the very first time I went to dinner church, I thought, I love this, and I don't have any problems with communion, personally, theologically. And I know a lot of folks who would really love this service, but would not feel comfortable with the communion piece of it. And so I spent a long time thinking about how we could hold those same feelings and that same sense of embodiment and deep spirituality without building it around the communion ritual. And so out of that, for me, these kinds of rituals and this kind of service reminds me that we are full humans. We're not just intellectual brains, but we have bodies that need to be cared for. We have spirits that need to be cared for. And to me, that is a deep core of Unitarian Universalism, that we show up exactly as we are, and all of that is holy. And it connects me with others, which for me is the other big core of Unitarian Universalism, community, right? That we do these things together. And so what it means to gather, to share a meal, to feed each other, whether it's folks who may not have access to food as much, or folks who live alone and are seeking that community. For me, it holds that as a really deep way of getting to be together.
Yeah, that's what I love about this word nourish, right? Because it feeds your body, but it also feeds your spirit. And that's sort of what I think of dinner church being. Can you tell me maybe if there are other examples of this kind of ministry? Are there other UU examples, or is it mostly Christian?
Yeah, so Reverend Emily, who I do Nourish work with, has been the minister of an emerging ministry in Colorado. That was the project of two churches. And they realized that a dinner church was the best thing for them. They were serving a lot of young families. And so being able to show up and have dinner provided and then go home in time for bedtime was exactly what they needed. They have now, in the pandemic, transitioned to a community garden focus. So still in the same ideas of food and embodiment, but in a different way. And then I think there are a lot of UU churches that not quite as explicitly as that do this kind of ministry. They gather people together for food. I think that coffee hour is actually a real example of this kind of ministry, what it means to nourish your body and to be in community with each other, and share about your lives. I think there are a lot of UU churches and other communities that do various forms of that, whether it's every week or we gather for a potluck. And then Martha talked about so many other religions that have these rituals. And I would say that I think, again, like the way I think about coffee hour, even if it's not explicitly spirituality, people aren't naming it like that. I think things like gathering for holiday meals, or the fact that when people have a birth in the family or a death in the family or are going through something hard, the thing that we do as people is bring food. We feed people, right? We say, either let's celebrate this together, or let's help you hold this grief by feeding you. And I think that is at its core the exact same thing for me as dinner church and even as communion, that we are in community together. And by being in community together, we feed each other. And, I think there are things like Bread of Life here in Malden, and even the Malden Neighbors Helping Neighbors, bringing food and other supplies to people. That's all that idea of this way of being together in community, is that we care for each other. And a big piece of that is that we feed each other.
Yeah, as you're talking, I was thinking about one big tradition that this church has had, which is Pie Sunday, which is the Sunday before Thanksgiving, which we haven't been able to have over the pandemic, and we probably won't be able to have this year, or we won't be able to have it in the same way. And how that is a very well-loved, well-celebrated, well-attended Sunday for us, and it is a tradition. Many years we've had even a camera to keep track of everybody who comes through, and it's a very it is part of the ministry of the church, for sure, and how we connect with each other. Another question that I have, which you kind of have answered, but if you have any more thing to say about how the pandemic has impacted, I mean, this has impacted so many churches. And I think that something where you have to eat during it could be particularly difficult. So I just wonder how this is. Obviously, you weren't able to open your dinner church here, but how else has this impacted your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting for Reverend Emily and I to have started a dinner church consulting business during the pandemic, right? That was not a thing we had in mind. And in some ways, it's been more possible because of the pandemic, because things have been virtual. Emily lives in Colorado and I live here, and we've been able to lead worship in California and in all over the East Coast and the middle of the country, and connected all kinds of folks. So that's a big piece. I think as much as I am really looking forward to the time when we can be physically at the table together, the pandemic has actually for me opened up my ideas of what it means to share a meal with people, right? So like, you know, my family did a Passover Seder, and we did Easter brunch, and we did Christmas Eve brunch and things like that, that if it wasn't a pandemic, if we weren't together, we just wouldn't have done them. And so what it means to be able to do them, even if we're not physically together. And I think it's been a really helpful reminder for me, and a reframing of things that we often just do as ritual in church, like communion. For me, the reminder that we can do those things in our homes, on our porches, in parks, right? That it's not just, well, we come to this building and that's where we get to have this ritual, but to expand that out into the places that we are, that are all also holy. And so actually, this is the moment I'm going to invite those of you who are joining virtually. This is time for you to take communion. Those of us here are going to take communion outside after the service. But if you are joining us virtually, I invite you to gather a bite of food or something to drink. It can be real or imaginary. That is another thing I have learned in these times, that rituals will meet the needs that you have in this moment. And if you're here in the sanctuary and you want to just maybe close your eyes or just take a deep breath and imagine some bite or sip, and you're going to take that and use all your senses to take it in. What it looks like and smells like, what it feels like, what it might sound like, and finally, what it tastes like. Take a moment to savor it here and now. And remember, as you do so, how powerful it is for us to share a meal. Even if we're not physically gathered around the same table, and whether or not we are eating the same thing, we take this moment to pause and intentionally nourish our bodies and our spirits. No matter what form it might take, the act of sharing a meal is powerful, and it connects us to each other. So let this bite, real or imagined, connect you to everyone who had a hand in bringing it to you, and to all of us who are gathered here in this moment in body and in spirit. As we take a deep breath and ground ourselves in the power of being together around the table, whatever form that might take.
Thank you so much, Reverend Aisha. That was really nice. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us this morning that I didn't ask you about?
I think just the reminder, going off of those last few things we were just talking about, that you can hold this sacred ritual of communion, of food, of nourishing yourself anywhere and anytime, at our picnic after the service today, or at lunch, or when you just have a moment and you're hungry and you're eating that protein bar to get yourself a little energy, just take a moment to remember that it is so powerful and spiritual to be feeding your body, this body that allows you to do the things you do in the world, and that is sacred and holy work wherever and however you are doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Aisha, so much for coming to my show this morning.
You're very welcome.
Being
Thank you for
interviewed.
having me.
We'll give you a round of applause.